Welcome to The Dirt on the Past, a program of the Extreme History Project that explores the good, the bad, and the ugly about our human past. Because, let's face it, Crystal.
Yep, history is not pretty, but it is so important to know.
Because it is the very thing that has led us to the most critical concerns that we have in the present. So join me, Nancy Mahoney.
And me, Crystal Alegria.
As we talk to archaeologists and historians who have been digging in the dirt.
And in the archives.
To uncover the fascinating histories that are not only relevant to today's issues.
But help us move forward in a better way with a deeper understanding of our past.
Well, hello, everyone. It's finally summer in Montana. Welcome to this week's edition of the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we're the co-hosts of The Dirt on the Past. This week, we are at the KGLT studios speaking in person with Lesley Gilmore about National Register nominations. So we are super excited to talk with our good friend Lesley. But first, Crystal, it's been a bit. Let's check in and find out how the last couple weeks were for you.
It was good. You know, it just turned summer here in Montana. We are recording this on July 5th.
Yes.
And I swear, you know, the last couple days have been the first days.
It was a cold July 4th.
Yeah,
oh boy.
It was cold. It was
Chilly.
cold. So I'm so excited that summer has finally arrived. But we soldiered through June, and we had a few nice days in there.
Yeah,
but it's nice to see some sunshine today. But we had a wonderful cemetery workshop that we did I guess that was just 2 weeks ago. And it was just great. We did it in Deer Lodge, Montana.
Very cool.
Which is a small town in Montana, and they have a beautiful cemetery. And so we had about 35 people who came out and took this cemetery workshop. And we spent a day learning about the importance and history of cemeteries, how to preserve headstones, and then also about cemetery headstone symbolism. So it was really, really a great day and a great group of people.
Were they mostly from Deer Lodge area?
No, they were from all over Montana. We had
Really?
some people come down from Malta, Montana.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and from Bozeman and from Helena and Butte and a couple, a few from Deer Lodge, but it was kind of from all over Montana. People came for the workshop, which was really great. We had some wonderful guest speakers, Ellen Baumler, who has been on our podcast before, and she wrote a book about cemeteries in Montana. And so she came and gave the lunchtime presentation. We did it in conjunction with the Foundation for Montana History and also the Deer Lodge Museum Complex, the old Montana Prison Complex. So those three entities kind of did this workshop together. So it was a really great partnership, and we hopefully educated a lot of people on the importance of cemeteries. So,
Nice.
Yeah.
Do you think you'll do more in other parts of the state?
We hope to, yeah. So we've already started talking about what we want to do next June and where, but I won't give that away quite yet.
Oh boy. Stay tuned, folks.
Stay tuned. So a different location with an awesome cemetery, another awesome cemetery. So.
Cool.
But what about you, Nancy?
Well, like you, it's been kind of waiting for summer to come, but there have been some gorgeous days in there. Got out to the Missouri River and actually got in it.
Good.
Completely up to my neck. My husband goes all the way under, but I don't. But it's been busy, lots of tourists back in downtown and all of that, which has been really fun. And since Ian has come back from Columbia, we have started planning a 10-day road trip through Montana, some parts of the state we haven't been to. So we're heading all the way out first to Ekalaka. And have you spent much time out there?
No, I haven't, but the Carter County Museum has to be a stop when you guys go.
Yeah. It's a small town, but, there's some amazing rock formations out there. And then there's kind of a pine forest reserve also out there. So we're going to spend a couple nights, and then we're going to head into Miles City and have like a cowboy saloon experience there, which you and I have done a little bit of that before.
We've done that.
And then we're going to head up sort of towards Fort Peck, and then head along the north side of the Missouri River Breaks area where there's a lot of the Prairie Foundation Reserve and some of those bison herds. Yeah. And there's a lot of great places for birding, for just gorgeous prairie animal viewing, and then hopefully some swimming in the river. So we're taking the dogs and we're just going to go for it. And I hope to find a lot of, historic towns, structures, things to visit, and some brew pubs that are popping up all over along the way. So that's kind of been what's on my mind, is planning a lot of that.
That would be wonderful.
I know.
Well, good.
So we should get back to Lesley and find out about her summer, too.
We should. But first, Nancy, I want to just talk about our sponsor for this episode. So a big thank you to the Montana State Historic Preservation Office, which we commonly call the SHPO, for sponsoring this episode of The Dirt on the Past. The Montana SHPO works together with all of us, all Montanans, to promote the preservation of our state's historic and cultural places, from archaeological sites to homesteads. The Montana SHPO is responsible for protecting Montana's historic places and paleontological resources under the Montana Antiquity Act, and assisting federal agencies when assessing the impact their actions will have on our wonderful historic places under the National Historic Preservation Act. So we are grateful for all that they do to protect and preserve our state's cultural heritage. So we thank them for sponsoring this episode of The Dirt on the Past. So, Lesley, we're so excited to have you here with us today.
Yes, welcome. Yay.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. So, Lesley, we always start off by telling our listeners a little bit about our guest. So here goes. Correct me if anything is wrong, and then we can point the finger at Crystal, since she
and I'll point it right back at Lesley.
Oh, there we go. So should be just fine. Lesley Gilmore is a preservation architect who lives and works in Gallatin Gateway. She has written architectural record forms and National Register nominations for significant residential buildings, commercial buildings, schools, and parks. She's focused on mid-century modern buildings, hoping to advance the appreciation of these oft misunderstood buildings. Her knowledge of historic architecture and materials is woven into her writing in these nominations, as well as in many of her articles in Bozeman Magazine. She currently serves on the boards of Preserve Montana, the Extreme History Project, and the Historic Preservation Board of Gallatin Gateway. So thanks, Lesley, for coming and bringing all that expertise.
Yeah, and Lesley, you've been a board member of the Extreme History Project for years, many years now, and you are not just a regular old board member. You are an active board member, and you do so much to help us with the Extreme History Project. You do a lot of actual work for us. So I'll call you up and say, Lesley, can you help with this? And you always say yes. So thank you so much for everything that you do for Extreme History Project. And I know you're equally dedicated to Preserve Montana and to the Gallatin County School Trustees Board as well. So no, that's not quite right. The Gallatin School, you say, what is it?
The Historic Preservation Board of Gallatin Gateway.
That's it. That's what I was, that's what I was saying. And you've done a lot of work to preserve the historic school in Gallatin Gateway. And I guess that's probably what I was thinking about when I was trying to get the school in there somewhere. But you've done so much work to preserve that school, and also to preserve a lot of other history in Gallatin Gateway as well. So, which is great. So welcome.
Thank you.
So my first question always is, what brought you to this work? What brought you to wanting to do historic preservation through the field of architecture?
Right. Well, it's my father. I'm a daddy's girl.
Aww.
And he has had a profound influence on me. So when he grew up in Philadelphia, he used to drive around in high school with his friend Jim Massey, who turns out later to have been head of HABS, which is part of the National Park Service, the Historic American Building Survey. And in fact, when Dad first moved to Portland, Maine, he went into the Clapp House and he looked in the closet, and there were drawings, HABS drawings, by his high school friend Jim Massey. But he and Jim used to drive around the whole Philadelphia area and look at historic buildings. And Dad did not go into architecture as Jim did, but he kept that. And we always had National Trust for Historic magazines in the house, historic preservation magazines. And when I was trying to figure out what to do, so I merrily went off to school for math. I realized in my bio, I have no education.
Clearly, and I was going to ask you about that, because you would be the first guest we have that would be completely uneducated, which is fine, but, just curious. No, but please do fill us in.
It's not to discredit my education, but I think like a lot of people, your real education comes through your work and volunteer process. And that's really what it was for me. I mean, I have a bachelor's in math, which does some good. In fact,
Yeah.
it does actually. And then I have a master's in architecture. Even though I grew up in a family with a mother who was working and earned her PhD, I did not think that I could be an architect. And it was when I was graduating with my
interesting.
math degree that I thought, oh, screw that. Maybe I can, So I did go to school for architecture.
Okay.
But it was not on my agenda originally. But most of my education has been through these firms that I've worked with that have specialized in historic preservation. And I knew that was my interest because of Dad and his encouraging me to do 2 HABS summers. So you can do, when I was in college, I did 3 HAB summers.
Okay.
I was in Gettysburg for 12 weeks, and actually they extended that so that I could complete the documents because you do ink on Mylar drawings that are according to the HAB
Yes.
standards.
Can you,
Tell us what HAB stands for.
Historic American Building Survey.
Okay.
It was established in 1933 as a consortium with the National Park Service, the Library of Congress, and AIA, the American Institute of Architects. They were trying to get architects and architectural students working.
Okay, so this
They
is
needed
way
income.
before, really, the
This is
National
way
Register.
before.
Okay,
Right,
That's
exactly.
fascinating. I
Yeah.
didn't actually know about that. And
Yeah.
was it generally focused more on eastern cities?
No, it's
Okay.
interesting because they worked very hard to not only have a geographic range, but to have a cultural and social range. So it wasn't just like the governor's mansion in New Jersey. It was Kennebunk Mines at its.
Nice.
And other mine building and other, small. Like Bannock was, actually their HABS drawings were the 1960s, but it was still in the mindset of HABS to have a broad spectrum
Fascinating.
of our history.
That was very
And
visionary.
It
for
was
that
very
time.
visionary,
Yeah.
and it's since been joined by the Historic American Engineering Record,
Okay.
which I can't remember what date, but that was a little later. And then even later, I think it was only maybe 20 years ago, the Historic American Landscape Survey. So there's HABS, HARE, and HALS,
okay.
and they're
Okay.
all housed in the Library of Congress.
Oh, wow.
And you can access a lot of them
I was
online.
gonna
It's a
say,
great,
what a
great
resource.
resource.
Wow.
Right. So if I'm doing a project, and whether it's a restoration project or a National Register, I'll often look up and see if there are HABS documentations about any buildings like that. Because it's not just drawings, they were hiring historians as well. So I did a summer in Gettysburg, right? They had these historians there that helped us understand why this farm building was of interest to, in this case, the Civil War battles that were going on in Gettysburg, but why historically it was of interest. And I worked on the Lincoln Homestead, and there was a big deal there about the type of framing in this shut house we were
Okay.
documenting, and it was crossover between braced framing and balloon framing. So it was just, their historians came out and were so excited.
So different technologies of construction, as well as styles of construction, as well as materials people were developing, all of that.
And
so that
the
whole
nails,
built environment.
and what wood,
Fascinating.
and when it would have been available,
Wow.
and how it was sawn, and the whole bit.
So you were drawing while people were writing this up, and then that's all within that record?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen Hab's drawings, but I didn't quite understand there was documentation along with those. So that's good to know.
Right. And sometimes there isn't.
Okay.
But that whole goal is to have that there as well. And we still do HABS documentations to this day. And so we did one of the MDU building in Billings, which was the sweetest little, I guess I'd call it streamlined, modern building from the 40s.
And MDU stands for?
Montana Dakota Utilities.
Okay.
And GSA, the General Services Administration, was going to tear it down. So one of their review mitigation aspects was that they would have it documented by HABS. It's considered a standard by which to document, both historically, and they have a form that's very particular about what order and what type of things you provide in it. And then the standards for the drawing are incredibly exacting.
Wow.
So oftentimes, if a structure is going to be torn down, they'll have this drawing done. But then even if it's not going to be torn down, if they just want to document it in some way, then
Yes.
they'd have this done. So either or.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Wonderful.
What a
So you spent
huge database of information. I imagine just getting lost in an archive like that. That sounds pretty fantastic. Wow. Wow.
So you did that for 2 summers. Where were you this?
3 summers.
3 summers.
So the first summer I was in spring. Is that right? Oh gosh.
Well, we're going to
the
fact
first
check
summer.
you later. Oh, no,
yes,
go
you
ahead.
will. Fact check. That's great. The first summer I was in Mentor, Ohio, at President Garfield's farming estate.
Oh,
so we
wow.
got to live in one of the tenant farmer houses, and we documented barns. And we had this great woman, Annie Evans from England, who came from, documenting buildings that were 400 or 500 years
Yes,
old.
I was gonna
And we're looking
say,
at these
yeah.
much younger buildings, but she had this system of a bucket of water and this little tube, a clear plastic tube that we would carry around with us because water finds its own level. So we would be able to measure so we could develop a datum line
Gotcha.
with this water level. And we were climbing all over this carriage house roof to be able to go from one datum line to the next, so that we could draw it accurately. The whole idea with HABs is very accurate so that you could rebuild it if indeed the building burned down. You could rebuild it from those drawings the next day as kittywampus as the building was.
Right.
Oh, well, hopefully you wouldn't rebuild the kittywampusness, but maybe you would. Yes, but maybe
you would
that's
know it was there,
fascinating,
isn't
though.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was
Yeah.
thinking just as we're digging as archaeologists, we're always, because we're going down, we have this level above the surface of the ground, and you're measuring down from that. Or if you have standing architecture in the site, then you're measuring up. But yeah, you will always need a datum, and I never really thought about how they do that in historic. For
Well, and now
historic
you
drawings.
use lasers.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
It's a lot easier now. So that was the first summer
And
in
super
Mentor,
fun. You have
Ohio.
cats. Yeah.
And the second summer was the Lincoln Historic Site in Springfield, Illinois. There's a 2-block stretch where they have removed buildings that were not there when Lincoln was inaugurated as a president. And so there are gaps there. It's really bizarre. But the ones that are there, he walked by, he saw, he touched.
Wow.
Right.
That's
right.
fascinating.
That was great.
Yeah.
And then Gettysburg. And my third summer was Gettysburg, and I got to stay on longer in order to finish some of the drawings because, I don't know. We needed more time to finish them. We did a lot of buildings that summer, and you get to meet people, architecture
everywhere.
students from all over.
Oh, how fun!
They were
that
really
must have been
good
amazing.
summers.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
So that kind of, that was between your bachelor's degree and your master's.
Now let's see. I guess.
Is that what got you interested in?
Well, that's what helped solidify
Okay,
it. And again,
okay.
it was my dad who suggested this. He showed me this piece of paper with this ad, and why don't you call in or write? And I was a little frustrated, though. And so I did this during my architecture training because I actually went to architecture for 5 years. I started at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, went there for 1.5 years, and then transferred over to the master's program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So I spent 5 years doing this. That's how I had 3 summers in there, and then the last summer I ended up working at an architecture firm. But one of the reasons I did this HAB stuff was because I didn't want to go work in an office. And my dad said, well, you could be outside.
You're literally doing field work.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you this, Lesley. So when you decided that you would become an architect and work as an architect, were you really focused on working somewhere where you would continue that kind of field work versus being in a firm where you were developing new buildings for people, even if they were to sort of be in the style of a historic structure? So were you more in the aspects of firms that did documentation for some kind of historic preservation purpose?
Generally, yes. And they also, so I focused on those firms. That's who I just glommed onto. I would go. There was a man named Bill Hasbrook. I went and spoke with him a few times, and then he finally gave me a job. And he was in the Chicago area, but he did more. He does more like what a full historic preservation firm does. So he did documentation. We restored the Dana Thomas House in Springfield, Illinois, which is one of Frank Lloyd Wright's early Prairie School buildings. And that's right after I left Gettysburg. I went to Springfield, Illinois, to be the on-site observing architect for Bill at the Dana Thomas House. So he, I think you call it from the frying pan into the fire, something like that. And that was my education.
Wow.
Yeah, that's when you really started learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also did, they did something called historic structure reports, which is like a National Register nomination on steroids. You also talk about the condition of the building and what types of things you can do to either restore, preserve, or renovate the building, and what your recommendations are material-wise.
Wow. I'm so interested in how, and that's a good segue into our next question, but I'm just also thinking somewhere along the line I want to ask you about the kind of documentation you're talking about with HABs versus sort of if you also had the original blueprint. So let me just put the blueprint question on the back burner and get right to that National Register of Historic Places, National Register nominations that you've been talking about, because you have been involved in filling out the forms needed to get something onto the National Register of Historic Places. So let's just start with, tell us about maybe the first time you did one and how many you've done, and if there's one in particular that stands out. Maybe your first one was really boring and you want to skip over that, but I'll just turn it back over to you.
My first one was really exciting, and it was in the Chicago area.
They have, I mean, that's just amazing architecture in that city.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was working for a man named John Eifler who met this black woman named Diane Heath, and she had bought this nice sandstone building on Martin Luther King Drive. And we started working on the building. Turns out, though, it was built in 1888, designed by Martin Roche, who was of Holabird and Roche, who was a big firm, the largest architecture firm in Chicago.
Oh, wow.
And he had designed this building for his brother-in-law, John Tate. And so we thought, oh, we've got a National Register nomination here. And I don't think she wasn't going for tax credits, because you can't, she wasn't renting the building out. It wasn't an income thing, but it was a matter of pride for her. When she realized the importance of this building, and it was a lovely, lovely building. And John Tate, the brother-in-law, was a stonemason. And so the fact that they used this red sandstone from Michigan, I mean, it was all just, the pieces all fell together beautifully. And John Tate lived there with his brother-in-law. I mean, Martin Roche lived there with his brother-in-law, John Tate. Martin never married, and so he lived with his sister and brother-in-law. And so we went to nominate the building, right? And we go to the Historic Sites Advisory Council, which is their statewide version of our Montana Review Board. And they said, gosh, you could go for more than just architecture. You should be going for the history of steel construction in Chicago, because here I am an architect, but I hadn't thought about the fact that they were using steel beams in this residential building in 1888 was actually it was kind of a big deal.
Pretty innovative.
And so it was innovative. And we were just going for architecture and the relationship to Martin Roche and that whole big deal with its history, essentially. So we're really going more for history than for the architecture and construction methods. And that's when I found that, I'm not going to say spin a yarn, but it's how you can approach a National Register nomination in a number of ways, and it can be a number of criteria. And sometimes, and they seem these days to be aiming for the more criteria, the better. So
we'll talk about that, what criteria is.
And they really wanted us to go for 2 criteria. And that's harder work. You have to do more research. You have to tell another story. But it still was my favorite, partly because Diane Heath was a great client. Martin Roche was an awesome architect, and it was just a great story. And we really enjoyed it. Was my first, and it was, you get up before the review board, you give a slideshow, you have to defend your case and answer all sorts of questions, including, well, why didn't you include criteria C?
And so we should discuss for listeners, as you were talking about the criteria, what it takes to be nominated as a historic structure, and then why that's important, what it does. So I'll toss it back to you, Crystal, too, if you want to refine that question. And
maybe what we could do is we could just, Lesley, you could just talk about the process for listing a property or a building or a residence on the National Register, and then we'll kind of dive down deeper from there. How does that sound?
Okay, that sounds good.
But I do want to come back, maybe before we do that, we can come back and talk about, so your first one was amazing. What other National Register nominations have you done throughout the country?
Right, it turns out
maybe the top 2.
Sure, but it turns out I've only done 5.
Okay.
And one state-wide national or state nomination in Kansas, because they have a whole different system. But I've done the Tate Heath House, Scoville Park, which was a historic district in Oak Park.
Okay, in Chicago?
In Chicago,
Okay.
Just outside of Chicago. The Gunderson Historic District, which was a 200-home suburban development, which represented the pattern of suburban development throughout the states, unbeknownst to me,
That's
until we
fascinating.
started the project.
Wow.
And these beautiful four squares, lovely, lovely buildings. It's a real pride to live in a Gunderson house.
The things you learn when you're doing these.
Oh.
I mean, and what you add to the historical record when you're creating these historic
Right.
nominations is
Right.
huge. Yeah.
Right, and you have to really, like for the Gunderson Historic District, we had started it as a volunteer effort. We gathered a bunch of volunteers and historians and architects and photographers in Oak Park and did a survey of these 4x2 blocks of these buildings because we kind of thought there might be something here. Well, there was a lot there. And the advertising that the firm did, and it was right on the train line to Chicago, how they got people to, you can buy your own home. Big deal. And this really was a movement across the country, though. And so it was good for the SHPO's office in that case to let us know that. I mean, I'm not a historian.
Yeah.
And even historians need help.
Yeah.
And that's what the state historic preservation offices are great for, helping you understand the context and why that would even be important or, nominatable. But you can also, I should zero in on, you can nominate for local significance. So that Gunderson district might have just been significant locally.
Okay.
Or it might have been significant on a statewide level or a national level. And I always figure if you're getting important, significant enough on a national level, maybe you should be looking at a national historic landmark, which is a whole another upper echelon. But you have different ways of being significant. And significant, typically the building or buildings are older than 50 years old. And that's so that we have a bit of a chance to step back and understand the history. There are some certainly, like Dulles National Airport that are not, and the St. Louis Arch that are nominated early because it's so clear that they are landmarks already.
Right.
I can't remember where we were going from there, so you asked.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the one that I wanted you also to talk about is that you were part of the nomination of the Montana State University campus.
No, I wasn't actually part of that.
Oh,
I was. I've nominated 5 properties to the National Register, and one of them was actually in Montana, the Federal Batten Building in Billings, which we just
You just finished
nominated
that, right?
last September. But I was for 8 years on the Illinois Review Board for National Register nominations. Okay. And then when we moved to Montana, I got a call within a year or two to ask me to apply to be on Montana's review board. So I was on that review board for 8 years. And John Axline and I both went out crying the day they kicked us off because you're so summarily kicked off the board. Your 2 terms are up, you're out of here. And he and I started the same day and we ended the same day, and we were in tears because you get to read all those nominations. You get to see the people that are either the owner, a steward in some way, or the person writing the nomination, and you learn so much.
And John Axline is the Montana Department of Transportation historian. So
right, we call him the Grand Recuser because he put forth so many nominations for bridges for Montana
And so
Department
then
of
he
Transportation.
would not be able to
vote,
on his
exactly.
own. So you actually have to vote whether they're getting in or not. I want to back up just a second. When you were talking about the neighborhood in Chicago that you were doing, or outside of Chicago, the suburban neighborhood, the Gunderson houses, you said it was a volunteer effort. So I just want to ask about how these things get started. Did the city ask you or the county to do it, or was it a place that you and some other people thought, well, there's probably some historic significance here, and start? How did that project even come to be, where it ended up in a nomination?
You're right about describing all those different ways it could. And this was a volunteer effort that started when we were on the Historic Preservation Commission, and we decided that, like a lot of places, like Bozeman, right this very minute, the more we know about what we have, the more we can determine what regulations we might need, what we might need to try and save. And we hadn't had a historic district nomination in Oak Park since the Frank Lloyd Wright district and the Ridgeland district. Let's see, those would have been in the early 90s. So we determined as a preservation commission that we needed to do a survey.
Was that a city commission or
it was
city?
a village commission.
Okay,
Right.
village.
And the
Okay.
village, though, gave us money to hire an intern from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago's Historic Preservation Program. So Suzanne German came on board and helped us with the survey and with the actual nomination itself. That's right. And we got the camera society, what the camera club of Oak Park or something, went around and taking photos for
cool.
us. Yeah, yeah. But when we did the actual nomination itself, the village paid us. I don't remember how much. Maybe they didn't pay us, but they paid Suzanne.
Okay.
It was a huge effort, though, because we were trying to do it on a database. This is all before databases really were sophisticated enough, when we wanted to tie the photos into the database.
Nice.
They have since kind of done that.
Right,
But,
right.
whoa.
Ooh.
So that's a huge one. So far you've given you the examples you've given us are a house, a residence, a subdivision,
Right.
and
right.
then the one you just recently did in September in Billings, that was a commercial building.
The Baton
Federal
building in Billings,
building.
the
Okay.
city has bought it. It was a general services federal building that they built in
Okay.
1965, or finished it in 63, designed by Link, J.G. Link, son of Link. Right. Well, J.G. Link was a huge architect throughout Montana, and his
Okay.
son, which carried his name, designed it in the 1960s, and they built it according to the federal guidelines. And it's a really standard federal building. Although I just have to say, I never use this word, it's prettier than the one in Bozeman. It's just more refined. The detailing is superb.
In what time period was it built?
So it was finished in 1963, so it's
1963,
mid-century modern.
Yeah.
It very much follows in with the guiding principles that GSA was mandating across the country, that President John F. Kennedy was supportive of and pushing forward, so that we would have good design, efficient design, and ideally efficient buildings. And there are a lot of similarities between a lot of those buildings, but they're also meant to have a regional aspect to them.
So they hire somebody local, but he would have had to work within the regulations of what the federal government had set
Right.
out. Okay, super interesting. So you do get that local and then national combination.
Exactly. And including local artists. Lyndon Pomeroy, who is the father-in-law of Pomeroy, our city commissioner. She married his son.
Okay.
He was an artist in Billings, and he designed this and constructed this beautiful steel mural, three-dimensional thing about the history of Montana in that building.
goodness.
It's absolutely beautiful, and it will still be in the building.
That's cool.
With the
Do you
city
know what
owning
they're
it.
going to use it for?
It's going to be a major focus in a new stair hall, open stair hall that they're building.
Okay.
It'll be, you'll see it even more than you did in the original lobby.
Nice.
wow.
That's
Okay.
fantastic.
So I guess I wanted you to talk about the project you worked on, just so people can get a sense that it's not just houses that are on the National Register, but all these different buildings and even subdivisions and bridges and, all these things that we'll probably talk a little bit more about. So now maybe you can just kind of go through that process of listing a property on the National Register, kind of in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, you call John Boughton at the State Historic Preservation Office and run your scenario by
Here
him.
in Montana.
Here in Montana.
Anyway, so every state
SHPO has a National Register coordinator.
Okay.
Right. And their job, and most of them do it, really seriously, is to bend over backwards to help you have a successful case.
Fantastic.
And if you don't, if the building really, if you're just off your rocker in terms of thinking that it might be significant for some reason, they will tell you. But they will work really hard to find a reason for significance. Ideally, and at this point, as a professional, you come to them with a reason, a rationale. But I could be, and I've seen these nominations. I could be a rancher outside of Miles City and determine that my family's homestead should be listed. I call John, and he will make it happen. and so you might accept a, quote, lesser nomination. It might not be as polished professionally, but if it's written from the heart and from that family, it goes such a long way.
So anyone can if they have a house or a structure or a commercial building or something that they think should be on the National Register, they can call their state entity, their state SHPO, and ask about it and see if it's viable.
Absolutely.
And oftentimes it is, it sounds like.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
What if the individual who's interested in having it done, say it is a rancher with a structure on their property that's been around for, over a century, what if they don't want to do the work themselves, but they'd like it to be done? Are there resources that the SHPO can give them of someone who might be able to help?
Absolutely. SHPO has a list of
people who do that work?
Right. And we've got some great historians and National Register nominators in this state.
And
We really do.
would they be someone you pay as a consultant, or might they do it out of the goodness of their heart, or it just depends?
It depends.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know that I love to do architectural descriptions. I love to weave this story about the structure and materials and all that about the building. Whether it's significant for the building or for history, I still like to weave that story. I will do that for other people on a volunteer basis. I've done that for John. I've done that for a woman named Joan Brownell, she's out of Absaroka, or the Stillwater area.
Yeah.
And so I'll do that for people just because it's fun.
You enjoy that.
And there are other people that do aspects of that. So sometimes it might not be that the whole nomination is
Sure.
a volunteer effort.
But
Because it
parts,
is a professional effort, there's no question. And there's a real learning curve to learning where to go. It's like, historians, they can blow your mind with what they can find, how they find it, where they find it, what they put together. And
And they can save you a lot of time, because learning how to do that. So getting back to kind of the in a nutshell thing. So we've gotten that you got the idea, you call there, they'll bend over backwards to help you. But are you then given a packet that is the basic form and instructions that
Yes.
you'd have to follow? And that's where you're saying there's a lot that goes into that might require research.
right.
Not just taking a photograph of the structure on your property and describing it. Okay.
Right, and it's taking the right type of photographs and labeling them a very, very specific way. And the rationale for that is that the National Park Service, who essentially is the keeper of all these nominations, they wanted, from day one, they wanted to be able to develop a rational database. And so the terminology, the category of building, the subcategory, it all has to fall within their specific language. And if it doesn't, you say other, and you find another phrase that deals with that. Stylistically, it's the same thing.
Okay.
And the way they want the descriptions to be addressed, and the way they want you to tell the story of significance and why the building is significant. And that goes to your other question earlier about the criteria upon which a building can be considered
Yes, let's
significant.
dive into that.
Right. So it's like ABCD.
Okay.
And I put it down to ABCs to make it as simple as possible so that I don't forget, because it's easy enough to forget. So A is for some A history. A history happened to,
Sure,
the history that the building weaves and is part of. And then B, of course I'm going to have to look this up. Oh, it's for a person. So if John Bozeman built this house and lived in it, or Samuel Lewis built that house, it might be significant for the person who built it and their role in the community. And it's not going to be the every George Washington slept here building.
Right.
I remember seeing a
Okay,
number of
that's not
buildings that, he slept here, but he slept over here as well.
Right.
And this is when he was planning his, attack against, the British over here. So that's why it's more significant.
Okay.
So there is an echelon of
Like if an
significance.
author was like, I was in the cabin in this woods, and that's when I wrote this novel that went on to become famous, that would be more significant than just,
Right. Than
that
just some hotel he
individual
stayed at for a
periodically
night.
went into the woods. Okay,
Right.
gotcha.
Right. And then C is for characteristics of construction, whether it's architecture or the structure of it. And that's where that that steel beam and the Tate House came in.
So whether you can see it or not, it might be something about the manner of construction, the materials used, or could it be a particularly great example of, an Art Nouveau design or something like that?
When I was on the review board in Illinois, I thought, oh my gosh, how many Italianate houses are we going to see? Well, it turns out that an Italianate house, like if it's the only one in Belleville, Illinois, can be significant locally. And a very, very similar Italianate building can be significant in Springfield, Illinois. And so it's not just that it's significant worldwide or even nationally. So every town can have their significant buildings.
What is that one on College Avenue and 5th Street? It's yellow and it looks like it's something out of Europe, and it actually has the whole half of the block behind it.
Oh, are you talking about the Second Empire one that Fred
yeah.
Wilson designed,
Yeah.
right?
The Graff House.
Yeah. Right,
Yeah.
that Second Empire.
And so the one, I mean, it
that's-
has all these little doors and windows and things, and it used to have a swimming pool in the back, I hear.
Right.
So that, would that be something, because it's such an unusual particular style, was that something the owners commissioned, and so that would be something possible?
It easily could be.
Okay.
And I think it probably will end up being part of the multiple property documentation form that your preservation board in Bozeman is doing for Fred Wilson designs.
Okay.
Yeah. But even still, it could probably be individually listed. But that there is a point to that, though, that if you're listed in a district, so take one of those Gunderson buildings, it is still considered as good as individually listed by
If it's
being
in that
contributing to
district.
a historic district. It's as significant as if it had been individually listed in the National Register and has accorded all the same benefits and harms that don't exist as any individually listed building.
And we'll get to that, but
Yeah.
let's finish. We've gone through A, B, and C.
Yeah, right.
Let's get to
and then
D.
D is one that I don't deal with too often unless I'm on a review board. It's archaeology. And it's the findings that have already been found or that they think are likely to be found when you start getting into doing any sort of exploration of the actual site. Like the site that's to the east of your Extreme History Project building.
Yes, that is a parking lot.
Right.
But we know that and it's a cement parking lot. It was capped after very significant buildings were torn down. So we know it's an archaeological treasure trove under there, of early Bozeman history. So
That was like that vacant lot in Virginia City that we
Yeah.
did with the field school, where people were just parking on it next to a building. There was no longer a building there. We knew from photographs that there had been. But as soon as you scrape the surface in some areas, oh my goodness.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're not going to go around scraping the surface of everything. You mentioned that you do have clues. There were some photographs. There will be some oral history. When you were looking at Fort Parker, a lot of history written and oral that led you to believe, this could be nominated for a D criteria.
Yeah.
So let's ask now why. Why do people want to or do, in that sense, what does it afford when you say any one of the houses, the Gunderson houses within that whole district would have the same, what is it, protections? What is it that you get by being significant, having that official significance?
You don't get any protection unless it's a federally owned or federally funded project.
Okay.
So there's a highway that's kind of south of the Gunderson district. If they wanted to expand that highway and go further north, well, if the buildings were federally owned or had some federal funding, then a Section 106 review would have to be done, and the IDOT at that point, similar to our MDOT, would have to at least consider the fact that
They might
there's
be
history there.
tearing down or removing historically significant structures.
Right.
Okay.
Now, in Oak Park, though, they actually have a program that we had in Bozeman for a while. It was a tax-freeze assessment. And the fact that those buildings were in a National Register district opened them up to the benefit of a tax-freeze assessment. And in that case, they could freeze their taxes, say it's the year 2023, freeze them for 12 years. Or actually, totally for 8 years. And so you freeze the value of the house, you can improve upon it, and you don't get taxed for the improvements the value that is accrued by your improving your property until year 9. And it incrementally it increases the value till year 12 when you're the value that you are after your improvements.
So
you've had
definitely a tax benefit.
Absolutely,
Okay.
right. And there are a
Very
number of
interesting.
states that have tax-freeze assessments like that.
And it doesn't preclude you from doing something to the structure.
Right. Now, when you are getting a benefit like that, you do follow the Secretary of the Interior's guidelines for the for the treatment of historic properties. And you might or might not have your local Historic Preservation Commission review the work. Typically, the state reviews the work. Sometimes the local commission is a sort of go-between.
So you could potentially lose that tax benefit if you altered the structure too much, not in accordance with its historic nature, or did some improvements that, really...
Right. If you did a large addition to the front of the house, you're not going to get that tax benefit. Right. And that's similar for the historic preservation tax credits, which commercial properties and rental properties can get.
So that's another benefit.
Exactly.
That
Huge
you can get.
benefit.
Yeah.
So for this federal Batten building in Billings, I don't even remember the millions that they're putting into the building, but they're getting a 20% tax credit.
That's huge.
From the government for income tax, and 5% from the state. And you might say, but aren't they a tax-free entity, the city? They are, but they are syndicating. They're selling the tax credits to a buyer. And they will buy them for like 90 cents on the dollar. So someone else will get the tax credit.
Interesting. Okay. And they're going to make money off that
Right.
then. Okay.
Right.
Fascinating.
Okay. So and anyone can get those tax credits, private or federal.
Right, as long as you're an income-producing property.
So it has to be income producing. So
right,
it has
and I
to be
think you have
commercial.
to, like if you're, the Masonic Temple building could have gone for tax credits. They decided not to for various reasons, but any building downtown,
So the
given
US
that it's
Bank
in a
building that
US
they're
Bank building that
redoing.
you were talking about with Pete, it might be getting tax credits. I don't know.
So the private residential houses can just get that frozen assessment, which really helps them.
If their state and city have that, and Bozeman
Okay.
used to have that,
We don't have
you
that
don't have it
anymore.
anymore.
No.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but that's what a city commission can pass if they want to, and they can put it into the city code. So that's a real benefit. But if you're just a residential owner, if you own a house that's historic and it's put on the National Register, you can't get those tax credits.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're starting to have more grants available in Montana. And there's the Montana Historic Preservation grants from the department that are managed by the Department of Congress. And that's the biennial, meaning every other year, grants that the legislature actually votes on.
Okay.
Which is a little bizarre because the Department of Commerce and SHPO rank the buildings in terms of their priority or their worthiness of receiving the grant. And this year, they doled out like $11 million to all 42 or 44 properties. Granted, they changed some of the dollar amounts, and they removed some properties because of some kind of new guidelines that are sidebars. The legislators called it, for wanting to make sure that these were publicly accessible buildings, so that we all could benefit from that.
So
credit.
the Armory building, which that thing sat there for over a decade when I got here, and then now it's this beautiful, they've built up to make it a hotel, but they preserved that base of it. That would have been something also eligible for maybe those kinds of, the same thing as the federal building in Billings, maybe tax credits that...
Probably doubtful. To build something that large, that's such an obvious change to it, even though, and some people, even preservationists will argue this, and there is kind of a debate going on in the preservation world right now about how strict should we be. We want to allow a little more leniency. When you look at the Armory, yes, you can see what it was originally, and so that's where someone might have an argument for that, but I still think that in this day and age, you would not be able to get tax credits because you've made too big a change.
It's too much of
building.
a change, and
Too much.
the interior is completely changed, and then you've built it up to a multi-story building.
Right.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Still, I'm glad they saved that base. I think it's beautiful.
Absolutely.
It's made for a gorgeous hotel downtown.
Right.
Yeah. So there are, and in other states, there's other incentives. Some states, some towns have different incentives, tax credit or grants or different things for buildings that are listed on the National Register.
Right. I mentioned that one in Kansas where they get the federal credit of 25%. I think the state is like 35%.
Oh, wow.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Okay,
Absolutely. That's big support.
It's good we're getting this out there because maybe we can start talking to our legislature. We're
Yes.
going to continue that thought right after a station break. You are listening to The Dirt on the Past with co-hosts Crystal Alegria and Nancy Mahoney on KGVM Bozeman or wherever you find your podcasts. We're speaking today with Lesley Gilmore about the National Register of Historic Places program. So that's fascinating. So from state to state, there's really quite a significant difference in what benefits you might be able to access if you put something on the register. In other cases, you had mentioned that sometimes it's a point of pride, wanting that documentation, somebody moving into a residence or wanting a whole neighborhood and a district. So talk a little bit more about the whole role that the National Register nomination process takes, not only with regard to the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, but the federal keeper.
Right. You present the nomination to the review board along with the staff who writes a report of support or not. Typically, at that point, they're supporting
The SHPO writes their own...
Right.
Okay.
Right. And they look for letters from owners. So let's see, if you're a historic district, you have to have at least 51% of the owners support it. So the SHPO sends out letters to the people in that potential district. And if you're, say, we're nominating the Gallatin Gateway School, it's a publicly owned building, so they don't necessarily have to have the school board accept the nomination or even support it. Although they do, I'm very happy to say.
That's great.
So the keeper does not have to have that support, although our SHPO does not like to submit nominations that don't have owner support. And if the keeper does get it, they will probably not list it, but they'll call it eligible.
So the keeper,
and leave it at that.
The keeper is at the national level.
Keeper's at the national level. And so once it is reviewed by the review board, there's a motion that says, I move that we pass this nomination on to the keeper.
Okay.
It's something simple like that. And our state people send it on to the keeper, and within 45 days, they have to rule on it and say yes or nay.
Okay.
So if they say yes, do they mail you those cool plaques that we
No,
see
the
out front?
plaques are part of but I'm so glad you mentioned the plaques, because
yeah.
our State Historic Preservation Office has a sign program.
Oh,
And
okay.
Ellen Baumler used to be in charge of it, and now Christine Brown is. And I think you pay like 50% of what the plaque actually costs. It's a bronze plaque. It's a standard size. They do an even better history of it that is a great synopsis that goes on the plaque.
Yes.
And if your building is individually listed or in a National Register Historic District, you can get a plaque. And you can have it mounted on a post in your yard, or you can have it
Right.
adhered to the building.
Wow.
Wonderful, wonderful to have. You could have one on the Masonic Temple building.
And who writes? You keep talking about that, so I think we got to
I know.
talk about that building.
I'm plugging it.
Yes, I know. I'm hearing that. We should get that out there. And who writes that lovely synopsis?
That would be, in this case, Christine Brown.
Okay.
And sometimes she can, with more recent nominations, she can probably pluck it and massage it, craft it pretty quickly from a current nomination. But if you look at a nomination from 1984, which, say, for all of Bozeman's Main Street Historic District is 4 or 5 pages long, you need a little more context to it. So she'll do more research and she'll pull it together.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Fantastic. So that's kind of a separate step, but how exciting! Yeah, that is to get, and it is so fun to see those at certain places around town.
Yeah, they're always really fun to see, and and we don't have enough of them in Bozeman. I don't think we have enough of them throughout the whole country. So, I always encourage people to try to list their house or their building on the National Register. So, and we have to do that. I have to practice what I preach and try to get our building, our Extreme History building, on the National Register too.
Yes.
Yeah.
You've got a good story there.
We do. We have a really good
Right.
story.
Great story.
A great
I know.
story. So we've been talking about that for a while, but I think we just need to go ahead and do that. And get
I'd be
that.
happy to help you with
Thank
that.
you, Lesley.
You're welcome.
I'll be calling you. That's great. So,
So
Yeah.
what I was going to ask is, you had mentioned before that our state now has grants. You said something like they handed out 11 million or something. Where can people find out about where? And you said it's every other year.
Right.
Granted, not to make a bad pun, but how do you find out where those grant resources are available and how to apply for them? Do you know?
The State Historic Preservation Office and Preserve Montana,
Okay.
our statewide preservation organization, both of them have documents that list what grants are available. And there are some very specific grants that are available that might not apply for your building, but they'll apply for another. So it's always worth looking at those lists.
Okay. So there may be some specific things. You might have something that we don't have enough of them preserved, and so they've decided to make that a priority and offer a grant for it. Okay,
Right.
fascinating.
And the State Historic Preservation Office has those grants also listed on their website, and those tax incentives and all that information listed on their website too. So
all right, so I know people are often. It's the same thing with saying, gosh, you don't want someone to find any archaeology on your land. People get nervous that the government is going to take your land. Something's going to happen. You can't do anything to your house. We've touched on this a little bit. But what does a listing on the National Register do in terms of affecting property owners' rights and responsibilities? So are there any specific restrictions on alterations or renovations, selling the property, anything like that?
Okay. Generally, no, unless you're using federal funding or you're on federal land for whatever reason.
Let's just say that again. Generally, no.
And generally,
Okay.
no.
For private individuals.
Right, for private individuals. And even for the Gallatin Gateway School. We reviewed this with them because the school board was very concerned about how they might tie their hands or the hands of future school boards. And so we were able to tell them generally no, unless you had a historic preservation review board or commission locally that had any sort of binding review power, which is actually very unusual. Even in Oak Park, we did not have binding review unless it had been listed as an Oak Park landmark, which is we only had like 9. So Gallatin Gateway does not have a review board. Gallatin County has a historic preservation board, but they don't review properties. Bozeman has their historic preservation review board, which or their advisory board. I don't think they do reviews, but the staff does reviews, and those I don't know if those are considered binding or not, because I've seen Crystal saying no, they're not binding. Right? Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the only time when
at different points in time they have been,
right?
But right now they are not.
Okay.
So,
Right.
So private property is pretty much private property, even if it's listed on the National Register. Is that correct,
Yes.
Lesley?
Yes.
Yeah. You can pretty much still do anything you want to do.
Right.
But if you tear down a house, in Bozeman anyway, there are fines. If you tear down a house in a historic preservation district, there is a fine. But most of the time you can do anything else you want to do.
Okay.
And is the fine only if it's what if it had been rebuilt, a rebuilt house? It wasn't a structure from the era of that historic district originally. Do you know if
I don't know.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a fine detail.
Yeah.
But in other words, if it's a historic structure consistent with the reason that district was nominated as a historic district, then you can't just tear it down without. Could you get potentially, if you petition our city
you
board?
can get a demolition permit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can't just do it though without
you
asking.
can't do it without getting permission, and you can get a demolition permit.
Okay.
So, like the armory we were talking about earlier, they did get a demolition permit granted, but they decided not to demolish.
Right.
And in the long run, they didn't. Thank goodness, because that's
Which
a
is
beautiful
wonderful.
building.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
But you can get a demolition permit.
Okay.
And that's where some of that review comes in with the Historic Preservation Advisory Board, is with demolition permits.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but generally, I think also in certain towns and communities that really depend on their historic preservation districts, those cities do have stricter guidelines. I can't think of a good example right now. Maybe you can.
Well, there are some
but-
good examples.
Yeah.
I mean, Savannah and
Savannah,
Charleston
Georgia,
have
yeah.
Right. I was
some,
going to
you
say
know,
there's some of these cities
Yeah.
people flock to because they have these amazing historic
Right.
districts, right?
So they
Right.
have much stricter guidelines, but here in Montana, ours are a little bit looser.
Well, it's always hard when you're talking about private property rights. But the deal is, get this, Meg Klinko in Oak Park owned the Thomas Gale House, 1909, Frank Lloyd Wright House.
Wow.
Standard kind of cantilevering
Yeah.
balconies with rough textured stucco. She applied for a permit to install vinyl siding all over that house. And she got the permit, which is what started the whole preservation movement in Oak Park, because she got a permit to do this. And like, you've got to be kidding.
Vinyl siding on a Frank Lloyd Wright
Right.
building. I can't even envision it, actually.
It would be very hard to install. But anyway, she was trying to make a point that you could do this, even in a town that you would assume. I mean, there are 25 plus Frank Lloyd Wright structures, including his home and studio in Oak Park. You would assume there's a strong historic preservation ordinance. And in 1994, I think is when she applied for this permit, there was not. So there are ways to make a point and to get movement.
Right. Exactly.
But it is an interesting point for sure that the benefits and the upsides. You know, it's not necessarily a tax benefit or this or that, but when we're talking about reasons that people can have thriving communities where they can live, but also there's commerce. I think Bozeman's downtown is one of these places people love to come because the downtown is completely occupied with these wonderful businesses, restaurants, things. It has such character to it. People really enjoy that. And those are places I know I enjoy visiting. So many people do. You're doing walking tours, all of these things. It is, I mean, those property values rise, they go
do.
up, but
There
then
are
the
studies,
businesses benefit too. So there's kind of that bigger scheme, not necessarily a direct. And it's so lovely to be seeing not only the Armory example, but the U.S. Bank being uncovered and people really honoring that, keeping the character of downtown here. So it feels in our community, even though we don't have these strict ways to necessarily protect or restrict or even and offer such tangible benefits, that people move here and buy here because they value historic preservation that is going on.
Right. And, you know, I don't remember the year, but when Courtney Kramer was our historic preservation officer, she was working hard with MDOT to get signs on the highway that would say Bozeman Historic District, because there are people who drive around all over the country, and if there's a historic district, they stop.
I love seeing those brown signs that are like historic point, something here. I know. I look for those all the time. That
and a
would be
lot
lovely.
of people do. And
They
so
do.
that really is an economic boon to the communities that have them.
We should take that up. And
They're up now.
They're up.
Is it?
They are
Okay,
up.
good.
She
Okay,
got 'em
that's
up.
fantastic.
It took a long time.
It took
but
a long time, but she
got
fought
'em
for it and
done.
she got them up. And then there are places like, I think they're called the Elkhorn Ranch, which is down in Gallatin Canyon. And I remember them coming to nominate their old ranch. And I was like, well, that's interesting. They were doing it as a source of pride, and I see it now as on their advertisements on their website.
Right.
We're listed in the National Register of Historic Places. That to them is an advertisement that would entice people, and it does entice
It
people.
does. It definitely does. I think people, especially coming to Montana, you do love that. Especially, I mean, we've talked about this with Yellowstone and then, 1923 and 1883. And, but just to have a sense of that landscape, how it looked when you were talking about Lincoln and having the buildings that he would have walked by or in. I think people do really appreciate that. And it should be a point of pride. And it's nice to hear that those things are happening out there and that people don't experience a downside to the nomination. It turns into something that's really an asset.
Right.
Yeah.
It sure is.
Yeah, and houses that are located in historic districts, their property values tend to increase. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that too,
Well,
Lesley.
the National Trust has done a lot of those studies that look at the value of those properties and do they increase because you're in a historic district, and they do. But now that there are disparities, though, and one of the things that we're trying to deal with as a field right now is the social inequities, and sometimes those property values increase too much, where other people cannot afford to buy or to stay there. And so we have some rectifying to do in that regard, I think. But the studies show very clearly that the property's values rise, which also means, though, that the taxes will rise. So there's
Right.
it's a complicated
It's
story.
complicated, but it does seem like in terms of then city, county, state level, being able to consider tax incentives, those incentives as something that can help mitigate and offset people being able to make these nominations. And we've picked your brain pretty much clean about this, and I feel so much smarter for it. I feel like I could answer some questions myself if someone had now. I'm sure, Crystal, you knew a lot of this already. But we do have a final question a little bit off topic, and as that about a book you have written called Canyon Village in Yellowstone, the model for Mission 66. So I would love if you could tell us a little more about this book and then follow up with where people can find it.
Right. So you gave me this question ahead of time. I still have issues with this.
It's hard to talk about herself.
Hard to talk about myself, but I can talk about Canyon
Yes.
Village.
Okay.
And what it is really the inaugural Mission 66 project within the whole Mission 66 project, which was a nationwide project in the U.S. that essentially went from 1956 to 1966. The whole goal of Mission 66 was a mission by Conrad Worth, the National Park Service director at the time, who had also gone through the CCC program and had a lot of men and women working throughout the states doing CCC. And so he understood the value of the economic benefit of fixing up these places that essentially in 56, a lot of people were coming back now. I mean, they're coming back from the Korean War. We've certainly come back from the Depression, but our parks were being loved to death. That's when that phrase was developed, and that's why. And we reuse that phrase now. Very similar reasons, but they'll show you photos of just landlocked or car locked. What's the phrase? Just car traffic in Yellowstone, and there not being enough accommodations and everything being run down. That was not just the case in Yellowstone, our nation's first national park, but all over all the park units. So that's national monuments, and there were like 440 units or something like that. There was a lot of land and property that had just fallen to the wayside. There were a lot of master plans in the 1930s that were put on the shelf. And so this is picking up things from the 30s.
This stuff has just been on the back burner. We've had wars where people come back. And so now, and you're saying this is in the early 60s, they're starting to take a look and implement. So what is it they're trying to do?
What they're trying to do is improve the roads in the parks, improve accommodations, and removing things. Oh, they were going to remove Old Faithful from Yellowstone. And they removed the Old Faithful pool.
And that's right. I was reading about that when I was there.
There were a lot of aspects
there was a
to the
huge
park.
Indoor pool, right?
There was. It was by Hamilton Stores. Oh, wow. And Hamilton Stores, the Yellowstone Park Company, those were, and then Wiley Camp Company were the three major concessioners in Yellowstone National Park. And the Yellowstone Park Company is the one that ended up developing Canyon Village, which was very, very difficult for them to do. It was an expensive venture. It was never meant to be as expensive as it was for the private concessioners. Oh, and Haynes Photoshop. Sorry. Haynes and Hamilton and Yellowstone Park Company were the three primary concessioners in the park, and they were all asked to renew their part of the deal was that Yellowstone Park Company's contract was being renewed in 1955 for 20 years, and Conrad Worth had a lot to ask of them. He wanted them to not just do Canyon Village, they were going to do Lake, they were going to do Grant Village, and there was a lot of work.
So create restaurants, create these lodges, create all sorts of things.
And the Park Service themselves would deal with the visitor center, which was a new building type. And deal with the road improvements.
Yeah, there were no visitor centers in the beginning.
There weren't. There were museums. Like Fishing Bridge Museum was the equivalent now of what is essentially a visitor center. And it was meant to include so much more. And yet they weren't even sure what it would or should include. And so like the Canyon Village visitor center ended up having to be enlarged in, 2006 or 8, something like that, because it still didn't accommodate what they realized were all the needs they had. So they were still experimenting. But this Canyon Village was an experiment. Welton Beckett, huge architecture firm, designed it. McNeil Construction, huge contracting firm. They built Disney World.
Wow.
And Welton Beckett designed Disney World. This is the caliber of people who were designing in Canyon Village. And it was modern architecture. It
I was going to say,
architecture
tell me about this image here
Right.
on the back of the
Right.
book.
The renderings were phenomenal.
That is cool.
It
I
is
would want to
very-
hang out there.
I
It
It's
looks
like
so
mid-century
I know.
modern.
Mid-century
Yeah.
modern, the coolest shape to the ceiling, the
Yes.
interior, where you almost look like you've got floating benches almost, but you've got these cool lighting system coming down from the ceiling, very open and lots of windows.
Right.
Very
Right.
cool.
90-foot long glulam beams.
Just
they were dealing
massive.
with new technologies and old technologies. And the design review process is highlighted in there because it's fascinating. And a lot of the review is by a man named Frank Matson, who is George Matson's father.
Oh, George Matson
Matson's
is
an
a
architect
local
here.
architect in Bozeman.
And
yeah.
George
Wow.
worked for McNeil Construction doing construction at Canyon Village
no
when he was
way.
out of college. Yeah, so there are a lot of very nice local
Connections to
Connections.
that.
And the
yeah.
Mission 66.
Mission 66. It was Conrad Worth's mission to improve the parks by 1966.
Okay.
He wanted to do it over this 10-year period. It lasted longer, and they called it the Parks and Recreation or some other phrase because they didn't want to have people even think that the mission had not been successful. But there were more projects to do, and I think they went through 1974 to complete the master plans.
Wow.
I just love
Wow.
this book, Lesley, so much. And I know that I always ask you to talk about it because it's so wonderful. Because I think people think that Yellowstone National Park is about the geysers and the animals, but there's so much human element to Yellowstone too.
Right.
And you really do such a good job of discussing that in this book. And so, and talking about buildings that, growing up near Yellowstone, I went and saw every year of my life and didn't really pay much attention to. And then you highlight them and document them and talk about them, discuss them. And now I go back with whole new eyes when I look at these buildings and these
I
places.
know. When I just took in my niece from South Africa, and my daughter was along too, and we're in there, and we had a gorgeous day, but there was a little bit of rain right when we were waiting for Old Faithful. We had driven there, and so we had gotten an ice cream, and we're inside, and I am just agog looking at like a whole forest of trees to build this place. I'm wanting to go up to the little tower at the top. Can I get up? And they're all just sitting there. They could care less. Yeah. And I know how I was probably like that at that age too, but it is fascinating to me to look at these structures. I mean, to think that thing, because I walk in and it's such a wonder. The fireplace, the height of that building and the inside, the craziness of it all. And then I saw there was a little sign that they'll give you a tour. And I so badly wanted to take that tour. Yeah. And nobody, I had no takers with me. So I have to go back with like you, Crystal. That would be way more fun. Yeah, clearly different ages, different generations, different interests.
Yeah.
Well, and with Canyon Village Lodge, Yellowstone was the personnel there was just latching on to accepting modern architecture, and their staff, their historic resources staff, was trying hard to push it. And to actually get the renovation of Canyon Village funded was a real coup on their part. And I'm so proud that they went to that extra effort. Because, Old Faithful, there's no question that it's... I think it might actually be a National Historic Landmark.
Probably is.
But it's more than just this range. It's more than just 1903. There's this whole history and evolving history of the parks. And I'm pleased to see that the parks are getting closer to embracing Mission 66 architecture. Yeah. But they renovated this building. The colors are there again. We just scraped away at the colors of the light fixtures. And so we have the teal, the orange, the yellow. And those beams are all exposed.
Oh, they should
and we've
bring it
opened
back.
It up. They have.
Now I'm excited to go look again.
You should go have a drink at the bar.
Oh,
my little question mark
awesome.
bar. Oh, it's so lovely. It's been relocated, but it was relocated as early as like 1964.
Right. Oh my goodness! Look.
It's a beautiful, beautiful building.
Yeah,
it really
is.
And the reason I brought it up was because they were doing surveys, and it turns out the younger people were very interested in retro.
Oh yes,
So,
and it feels it has that kind of vibe.
Right,
It's not like the old timey Old Faithful, but this is this very cool retro, and to see it in a park. Oh gosh, look at the little rooms you could stay in.
We're looking through Lesley's book right now, but
okay, right. So we'll post.
So Lesley, if people want to to get this book, where can they find it?
Well, I believe they can still find it at the Country Bookshelf.
Yes.
They were kind enough to have
Here
an
in
opening
Bozeman.
for it.
Yep.
Here in Bozeman on Main Street. And you can get it through Amazon.
Okay.
And you can get it, I do believe, at the Extreme
can.
History Project's headquarters at 234 East Mendenhall.
Yes. Wonderful.
Here in Bozeman.
Good plug. So we have about 3 copies left. So I'll have to talk to you
All right,
about
you got to
more,
pull one
too.
for me,
Yeah,
okay, so I can get over there. Yeah,
one's
you got
yours.
this out right before the pandemic hit.
Yeah,
Good for you.
yeah.
So that's great. A little pandemic reading for some people, I'm sure. Well, I'm thrilled. And having just been through the park, it just reminded me of all of those things, not just the animals and the incredible views, but all those other aspects that I feel like I'd love to go back and explore. So I know I feel like I need a week in Yellowstone
I know,
to do that.
I
right?
know.
A day.
Yeah.
It's not
Does
enough.
not.
It's not
Just
do
a-
it.
Yeah,
right.
just a
And the
little
other thing
taste.
to remember about Yellowstone is it's like 95% wilderness.
Yeah.
Still.
Absolutely.
Still.
Which
And
is
we-
wonderful. It's
Exactly.
wonderful. Right. Exactly. So I think we've kind of taken up most of our time here today, maybe even gone a little over, but it's been incredibly fun.
Yeah, what a fun conversation.
I know. So, Lesley, thank you so much. And we want to also thank all our listeners out there for joining us today. If you love this podcast, please tell a friend and make sure to subscribe so that it shows up in your podcast feed each week. And leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Thanks for listening today, and we hope you can join us again to find out more about
The Dirt on the Past. Thanks, Lesley.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Yeah. So thank you again to the Montana SHPO for sponsoring this episode. We sure appreciate it. And a big thank you to our editors, Drake Pinnell and Sierra Thomas. Thanks to Lawson Alegria for mixing the music, and to Steve Durbin at KGBM and John Chadwell for help getting the podcast out in the world.